Good evening and welcome. Tonight I want to start showing you this book I got at my used bookstore for only like $12 too. It is the Kingfisher History Encyclopedia. I have a Kingfisher History Atlas, which I keep meaning to show you, but anyway, this one's really interesting because this is a gigantic book, and I've been reading it at night before I go to bed to help myself wind down. And I thought, you know what, I should really just be reading this on the channel with everyone else. So let me show you. This is the coolest little book. Very large book. Let me show you the table of contents because it really outlines just how extensive this book is. It covers like pretty much every major topic in world history, which I love. So we're obviously starting off with the ancient world, 40,000 to 500 BCE. And we're going to start off with the first humans from 4,000 to 10,000 BCE. Let me set that down. And I've got pencil to help us read. It says, the earliest human-like creatures evolved over a period of several million years. Our closest true human ancestors have developed only within the last 50,000 years. The earliest hominids, or human-like creatures, were the Australopithecines. Many of their bones have been found in East Africa. They walked upright and made simple tools from pebbles. They were probably not true humans because their brains were very small in comparison. Proto-humans. Homo habilis, or handy human, appeared about 2 million years ago. This hominid had more skills and lived alongside the last of the Australopithecines. The most advanced early human was Homo erectus, or upright human, and remains have been found in Africa and Asia. By learning to use fire to cook and keep warm, Homo erectus was able to move from place to place. Neanderthals. About 200,000 years ago, Homo sapiens, or wise human, developed from Homo erectus. At the same time, another human type, the Neanderthal, adapted to the colder climates of the last ice age, spreading through the continent of Europe and the Middle East. The Neanderthals developed many different simple stone tools, though their language was limited. They did not survive into modern times. The last known Neanderthals died out in Spain around 28,000 years ago. Cro-Magnons. The humans of today are probably descended from the Cro-Magnons, a group of hunter-gatherers who seem to have entered Europe from the Middle East and eventually replaced the Neanderthals. These people gathered fruits, berries, and roots and hunted wild animals. They lived in simple caves and shelters. Around 40,000 years ago, they had developed mentally to become more like modern humans, with more ideas and a larger vocabulary. They began creating artworks, including cave paintings in France, Spain, and the Sahara. They made jewelry, figurines, clothes, shelters, tools, and hunting weapons. Moving on to the first farmers, 10,000 to 4,000 BCE. People's lives changed greatly with the development of agriculture. Slowly, they discovered how to domesticate animals and began to cultivate plants for crops. The earliest farmers settled nearly 10,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent in the Middle East. Here, people grew wheat and barley. They kept goats, sheep, pigs, and cattle that they used for meat, milk, hides, wool, and to carry things. The improvement in the design of simple tools allowed people to clear land more effectively, build villages, and stay in one place. Later, agriculture developed in fertile areas in China, northwest India, Iran, Egypt, southern Europe, and Mexico. Domestication. The first animal to be domesticated was the dog, as early as 10,000 BCE. Dogs were used for herding and as night guards. The horse, goat, and sheep were also domesticated. Farmers learned how to breed animals in order to change their characteristics. A number of species spread as well. Chickens and pheasants, for example, originated in the Far East. Meanwhile, some animals, such as aurochs, were hunted to extinction. Irrigation. One of the most important inventions was irrigation, a system of supplying cultivated land with water. Farmers in the Fertile Crescent and Mesoamerica dug channels to carry water to their crops. Using reservoirs and sluiceways, land lying far from rivers could be made fertile. In Egypt and China, annual floods were controlled to provide irrigation. In wetter climates, drainage was also important. After many generations, some farmers started bartering goods with neighbors and travelers, leading to the growth of trade and the founding of the first towns and civilizations, like Sumer and Akkad, 5000 to 1600 BCE. The first people to settle in Mesopotamia were the Sumerians more than 7,000 years ago. They built a number of independent city-states, the first civilization. The Sumerian civilization consisted of a number of city-states, cities that were also independent nations. Some of these cities lasted for 3,000 years. They were located on important trade routes along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Their traders traveled to Egypt and India. Sumerian cities. Each city-state had fine public buildings, markets, workshops, and water systems. There was a royal palace and a ziggurat, on top of which was a shrine dedicated to the god of that city. Around the public buildings were houses. Beyond these lay the farmers' fields and the marshlands of the Mesopotamian rivers. Reading and writing. The Sumerians devised one of the earliest writing systems, cuneiform. From about 3200 BCE, they wrote on clay tablets, and scribes held a key role in their society. Thousands of tablets have survived, containing accounts, records, sacred scripts, and letters. The contents of their graves have shown that the Sumerians were wealthy and their craftspeople skilled. Internal strife. Around 2900 BCE, with city populations growing, power shifted away from the priesthoods, which had been all-powerful, commerce gradually becoming more important than religion. Rivalry between different cities grew, and they fought each other for supremacy. They were also invaded by tribes from Persia, Arabia, and Turkey who wanted to share the city's wealth and power. Akkad and Ur. Eventually, the city of Akkad grew dominant. The city was led by Sargon, who created the world's first empire around 2334 BCE. His rule brought more order, but it also brought cruelty and violence. Around 2100 BCE, as Akkad declined, the city of Ur took its place, rising to prominence for a century. After its fall, Assyria and Babylon grew to dominate the area. Moving on to Ancient Egypt. 4000 to 1800 BCE. Ancient Egypt was surrounded by deserts, but it was green and fertile because of the Nile River. It flooded every year, depositing rich, silty soil along its banks. The Egyptians used the Nile for transportation and cultivated the land alongside it. They grew wheat and barley for bread and beer, and flax for linen. They raised cattle as beasts of burden. Egyptians had a highly developed religion and advanced medical, astronomical, and engineering knowledge. The Pharaohs. For most of their history, Egyptians were united in one kingdom. Administrators and priests ran everyday affairs, but the head of society was the pharaoh, a living god. People believed that ceremonies he performed kept the goodwill of the gods, kept the Nile flowing, and kept society in order. When the pharaoh died, his body was mummified and placed inside a stone sarcophagus in an imposing tomb, along with jewelry, clothing, furniture, and food, everything he would need for eternity. Sacred writings on the tomb walls were meant to protect him in the afterlife. Egyptian society. Most people in Egypt were farmers. They gave part of their produce to the local temple as taxes. Very few people could read and write, and schooling was only for boys. Those who could write were called scribes. It was they who went on to become the priests and administrators who ran the country for the pharaoh. But at the heart of Egyptian life was communication with the gods. Toward this end, the Egyptians created remarkable works of stone carving. They built enormous pyramids and temples. Tall obelisks were cut from one block of stone. No effort or expense was spared to honor the gods, or the pharaoh, who was their living link with humanity. The Egyptians developed a way to preserve the body of their god king, and many building projects were undertaken to provide him with a tomb for his eternal protection. In time, everyone who could afford it would have their preserved bodies placed in tombs, with treasures for the afterlife and sacred scrolls to guide them to it. Return to greatness. After the time of the first pharaohs and the pyramid builders, there was a decline that lasted for over 100 years. With no strong ruler, the people felt the gods had abandoned them. Then, around 2040 BCE, obviously, Mentuhotep became pharaoh, brought order, and restored Egypt's greatness. This period's called the Middle Kingdom. The pharaohs reorganized the country and again built pyramids, although not as large as those at Giza. Some of Egypt's finest art and literature was produced during the Middle Kingdom. Egypt had been isolated from the rest of the world at this time. Ancient Egyptians were not great travelers, sailors, or conquerors, but great Middle Kingdom rulers such as Amenemhat I and Senwosret III expanded Egypt's boundaries. They built forts to protect the country and created a strong army. They invaded countries such as Nubia to take control of gold reserves. Moving on to Megalithic Europe, 4500 to 1200 BCE. In Spain, France, Ireland, Britain, and Sweden, there are ancient megalithic monuments, remains of an ancient civilization that built large stone temples. One of the most impressive monuments from this period is Stonehenge in southern England. It was built in 3 stages from 3000 BCE onward, forming a circle of huge, dressed or shaped, upright stones linked by lintels or beams. Scientists think that it was used as a temple, a place to study the stars and to calculate the calendar. Even older and larger than Stonehenge is the Avebury stone circle, a few miles to the north. It is a much larger ring of stones that have not been dressed. Many other stone circles in a variety of shapes and sizes are found elsewhere in Britain, with names like the Merry Maidens, Long Meg, and Callanish. The ring of Brodgar in the Orkney Islands off northeast Scotland is about the same age as Stonehenge. The stones there are tall, thin, and pointed. Mainland Europe. Stone circles have been found in the west of Ireland that are even older than those in Britain. At Carnac in Brittany in northwestern France, there is an impressive series of avenues made up of 3,000 large stones stretching for several miles. Brittany also has many single standing stones called menhirs. Standing stones are found all over Europe, from Spain to Ireland and Scotland to Sweden. Many stone chambers or barrows were covered with soil to make a mound. They are found in France, Ireland, and England. There are also quoits, made up of 3 vertical stones with a single large slab balanced on top. I've never heard that term in my life. Quoits? Anyway. Another remarkable collection of megalithic monuments is in Malta. Some of the oldest have walls made of massive stones. Several of the temples contain dressed stones carved with simple designs. The most remarkable Maltese monument is the Hypogeum, an underground temple carved on 3 levels deep into the rock. The Indus Valley, 4000 to 1800 BCE. The early peoples of the Indian subcontinent lived on the banks of the Ganges and Indus rivers. The first civilization sprang up in the Indus Valley, now in Pakistan. The 2 largest cities in the Indus Valley around 2000 BCE were Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, each with around 40,000 people. They were among the world's largest cities at the time. At the center of each lay an artificial mound which served as a citadel or stronghold. On this mound stood a large granary which to the population served as a kind of central bank. These forgotten cities were only discovered in the 1920s. City layout. Around the citadel, the city buildings were arranged in a grid pattern: administration buildings, markets, storage areas, workshops, houses, and temples. Each house was built around a courtyard and had rooms, a toilet, and a well. Buildings were made from mud bricks baked in wood-fired ovens. The citadel at Mohenjo-daro had a bathhouse as well as private and public baths and meeting places. Farmers and craft workers. Among other crops, the farmers of the Indus Valley grew barley, wheat, cotton, melons, and dates. Elephants and water buffalo were tamed to work in the fields. The area had many skilled potters who used wheels for throwing pots, a new technology at the time. Harappans used stone tools and made knives, weapons, bowls, and figures in bronze. They had an advanced system of waste disposal that included the building of covered drains and the installation of garbage chutes. The end of civilization. No one knows who the people of the Indus Valley were or where they came from. We do not understand their writing either. The area had similarities to Sumer, but also major differences. The city dwellers traded with the cities of Sumer. They also traded with the tribespeople of India and Central Asia. The Indus Valley civilization lasted 800 years, but came to an end around 3,700 years ago. No one knows why it ended, but there are various possible causes: floods, disease, a breakdown in trade, the economy or civil order, or immigration and takeover by the Aryans who moved into India from Central Asia. All trace of the cities lay buried under sand until they were rediscovered in the 1920s. Moving on to Ancient Crete, 3000 to 1450 BCE. The earliest European civilization began on the island of Crete about 4,500 years ago. It is called the Minoan civilization after the legendary king Minos. Stories say that Minos built a labyrinth or maze in which he kept a minotaur, a creature with the head of a bull and the body of a man. The Minoan civilization was at its height from 2200 to 1450 BCE. The Minoans owed their prosperity to their abilities as seafarers and traders. Minoan cities. The Minoans built several large cities connected by paved roads, each of them a small city-state. At the heart of each city was a palace with a water supply, decorations, windows, and stone seats. Minoan craftsmen were renowned as potters and builders. They also made beautiful silver and gold jewelry. The capital, Knossos, had the grandest palace. It had splendid royal apartments, rooms for religious ceremonies, workshops, and a school. The internal walls of the palace were plastered and decorated with large, magnificently painted pictures. Downfall of a civilization. Advanced Minoan civilization came to a sudden and mysterious end in about 1450 BCE. A volcanic eruption on the nearby island of Thera had already been a major disaster, overwhelming much of Crete. The end came when Knossos was invaded by the Mycenaeans, who greatly admired the Minoans and took their ideas to the European mainland. In Crete lay the roots for the later Greek classical civilization. Let's read about the Mycenaeans, 2000 to 1200 BCE. Mycenae was a city on the southern peninsula of Greece. It was the center of the first Greek civilization, which developed after that of the Minoans in Crete. The Mycenaeans, known as Achaeans, migrated to Greece from the Balkans around 2000 BCE. Mycenaean civilization began as a series of hillside villages occupied by people speaking an ancient form of the Greek language. By about 1650 BCE, many villages had grown into fortified towns with rich palaces and luxurious goods that rivaled those made by the highly skilled Minoans. Mycenae consisted of about 20 city-states. Mycenaean tombs. Before they built fortresses and cities, the Mycenaeans buried their leaders in elaborate beehive tombs. These were built of large stone blocks shaped to form a great dome. One tomb at Mycenae, the treasury of Atreus, has a doorway nearly 20 feet high that opens into a chamber 43 feet high and 46 feet wide. It was once lined with bronze plates. The richness of these tombs shows that a great deal of money and effort was spent on royalty and the aristocracy. One king had as many as 400 bronze smiths and hundreds of slaves. Wealthy Mycenaeans treasured the gold that they imported from Egypt. Skilled crafts workers made gold cups, masks, flowers and jewelry. Even their swords and armor were inlaid with gold. Expansion and downfall. Around 1450 BCE, the Mycenaeans conquered Crete and established colonies around the Aegean Sea and on the islands of Rhodes and Cyprus. They traded throughout the Mediterranean, particularly with Phoenicia, Egypt, and Italy. However, around 1200 BCE, Mycenae fell to invading wandering raiders called the Sea Peoples. Many Mycenaeans were forced to flee to other countries. Moving on to the Shang Dynasty, 1766 to 1122 BCE. The earliest civilizations in China from around 3200 BCE grew up on the banks of the three largest rivers, the Huanghe, Changjiang, and Xijiang. Like the people of Sumer, Egypt, and the Indus Valley, Chinese farmers relied on the country's rivers for transportation and water to grow their crops. Paddy fields needed floods in springtime to help the rice grow. But the Chinese also faced two dangers: major floods and devastating raids by tribes from the north and west. Early cultures. The first small towns appeared around 3000 BCE during the Longshan period around the Huanghe or Yellow River in the north. According to tradition, Huangdi, the Yellow Emperor, was the first emperor from around 2700 BCE. The first dynasty was that of the Xia, who ruled for 4 centuries from 2200 BCE. Yu, its founders, credited with taming the rivers by building dikes to stop floods and also irrigation channels. Tang and the Shang. The earliest dynasty we have evidence for was the Shang, founded by Emperor Tang. The Shang ruled North China for more than 600 years. They lived in a string of cities along the Huanghe, with the capital at Anyang. The city had many large palaces and temples, built mainly of carved wood. The Zhou dynasty replaced the Shang in 1122 BCE. The Shang people grew millet, wheat, and rice, and also mulberries for feeding silkworms, from which they produced silk. They kept cattle, pigs, sheep, dogs, and chickens, and hunted deer and wild boar. The Shang used horses to draw plows, carriages, and chariots. Early in their history, they used cowrie shells as money, later switching to bronze. They were skilled in working bronze and jade and made highly decorated practical and religious objects. Chinese writing. Around 1600 BCE, the Shang developed the earliest forms of Chinese calligraphy, a pictorial writing in which each letter represents a whole word. The Chinese script we know today evolved from Shang writing. The Shang worshipped their ancestors, who were seen as wise guides for their way of life, and they used oracles to help them make decisions. Moving on to the Hittites, 1600 to 1200 BCE. I'm just going to keep going until my eyes get sleepy. I kind of wanted this to be 25 to 30 minutes, but I'm in the zone right now. Let's keep going. Around 1650 BCE, a number of small city-states were united through warfare. The result was the rich and powerful Hittite kingdom. The Hittites consisted of several tribes, and they spoke as many as 6 languages among them. One was the language of the Hatti, the original occupants of Anatolia. The Hittites were the first to use iron, a metal that replaced the softer bronze. The Hittite Empire. The Hittites were a warlike people. They controlled the supply of iron, and they used chariots, which gave them a great military advantage. They worshipped around 1,000 gods, chief of which was a storm god. Early on in 1595 BCE, they sacked Babylonia, plummeting it into a dark age. Gradually, they conquered Anatolia, Syria, and the Levant and Lebanon, challenging the hold that the Assyrians and Egyptians had on the area. The Hittites adopted civilized ways such as writing from other peoples. They also introduced the horse into the Middle East from China. Men were dominant in society, and they were rich and well-traveled. The Hittites reached their peak around 1300 BCE. The Hittites survived many threats until they fell to the Sea Peoples. Finally, they were destroyed and occupied by the Phrygians, who came from the Balkans to the north. The Hittites were never heard of again, but they had had a strong influence on the neighbors. Babylon. Ur's domination of Mesopotamia was followed by many invasions. Around 1894 BCE, the Babylonians replaced their rulers with a dynasty that lasted 300 years. The Babylonians began to dominate southern Mesopotamia under their sixth ruler, Hammurabi the Great. He was a highly efficient ruler, famous for the code of laws that he laid down, and he gave the region stability after turbulent times. Babylon became the central power of Mesopotamia. The armies of Babylonia were well disciplined, and they conquered the city-states of Isin, Elam, and Uruk, and the strong kingdom of Mari. But Mesopotamia had no clear boundaries, making it vulnerable to attack. Trade and culture thrived for 150 years, but then the Hittites sacked Babylon in 1595 BCE. Its cities continued for 100 years under different foreign rulers. Then for 500 years, Babylon was overshadowed by Assyria before its next rise to greatness. Early science. The mathematicians of Babylonia devised a system of counting based on the number 60, from which we get the number of minutes in an hour and the degrees in a circle. Babylonian scholars developed early sciences and astrology from the knowledge they gained from the Sumerians. For my podcast, I want to do an episode on the Code of Hammurabi. A very personal connection with it, and I got to see it in person, and it meant a lot to me. I want to talk about it one day on my podcast. Let's read about the Assyrians, 1900 to 612 BCE. While Babylonia ruled southern Mesopotamia, the warlike Assyrians dominated the north. Their kingdom lay in the valley of the upper Tigris River. King Adad-nirari I, the country's first powerful ruler, enlarged the Assyrian lands and took the boastful title King of Everything. He and his successors were fierce dictators who did not allow individual states to be independent. Assyria grew rich through the activities of its trading families, who sold textiles and metals far and wide. Collapse and rebirth. As Assyria grew in size, rebellions by its conquered subjects increased. Eventually, Assyria fell to the Hurrians, relatives of the Hittites. The Hurrians dominated Assyria for over 250 years. As their overlordship dwindled, Assyria grew in strength again. Its next period of greatness lasted for 300 years. It reached its height under Tiglath-Pileser I, who led many campaigns against neighboring lands. Assyria eventually dominated the whole region, including Babylon. Assyria flourishes. From about 1076 BCE, Assyria and Babylonia were overrun by Aramaean tribes from Syria. But 150 years later, Ashur-dan II and his successors reconquered the Assyrian Empire. The capital was moved to Nineveh, and buildings were erected and irrigation schemes undertaken. Assyrian kings expanded their lands to control all trade routes and suppress troublesome neighbors. The Assyrian Empire was at its greatest extent under Tiglath-Pileser III, when it included the lands of Babylon, Syria, Palestine, Cyprus, northern Arabia, and Egypt. Roosters awake. Assyrian life. The Assyrians were great builders and erected magnificent cities, temples, and palaces. The men wore long coat-like garments and were bearded. Women wore a sleeved tunic and a shawl over their shoulders. It was not unknown for men to sell their wives and children into slavery to pay off debts. The final chapter. The last and greatest ruler of Assyria was King Ashurbanipal. He was a scholarly king, and during his reign, he created a huge library in Nineveh, his capital. The ancient records of Sumer and Akkad were preserved on clay tablets, together with literature and histories, mathematics, and astronomy from ancient times. When Ashurbanipal died in 627 BCE, the Assyrian Empire fell to the Babylonians and Medes. The Hebrews, 1800 to 587 BCE. The Hebrews first settled in Palestine about 4,000 years ago. They came to Palestine from Ur, although no one knows exactly where they came from before then. Their name meant the people from the other side of the Euphrates River. Their story is told in the Bible. According to the Old Testament, the leader of the first Hebrews was Abraham, a shepherd who lived in Ur. Abraham traveled with his family first to Syria and then to Canaan, now Palestine, where they finally settled. early years. Abraham's grandson Jacob, also called Israel, had 12 sons. He is said to have started the 12 tribes of Israel, which were named after his sons. When famine struck Canaan, Jacob led his people to safety in Egypt. Later they became slaves of the Egyptians until Moses led them out of Egypt and took them back to Canaan, probably around 1200 BCE. There, led by Joshua, they fought the Philistines, or Palestinians, for the right to settle and establish the land of Israel. Tradition has it that they used the sound of trumpets to bring down the walls of the city of Jericho. The first state of Israel. Around 1020 BCE, the Philistines began to threaten the Hebrews. To defend themselves, the Hebrews banded together and appointed Saul their first king. His successor, David, united all the tribes, made Jerusalem the new nation's capital, and added a number of other territories. As defensive measures, his son Solomon built several new cities and a wall around the capital. The Great Temple at Jerusalem was his most famous work. He was a peace-loving and wise king. According to the Bible, Solomon was a wise king. Okay, it is said that 2 women came before him with a child, each claiming to be its mother. Solomon suggested that he cut the child in 2 so each mother could have half. One woman broke down and gave up her claim. Solomon recognized her as the true mother and gave her the child. His reign marked the peak of Israel's history. After he died, his people argued and divided into 2 nations, Israel and Judah. Troubles and dispersion. After a rebellion by the Israelites, the Assyrians captured Israel in 721 BCE and then Judah in 683. The Jews scattered in various directions and many were carried away to Assyria as slaves. Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon crushed a Jewish rebellion in 597 and most of the Jews were taken to Babylon. During that exile, much of the Old Testament of the Bible was written down. This was the beginning of the diaspora, the dispersion of the Jews, which lasted into the 1900s. Moving on to Egypt, the New Kingdom, 1550 to 1070 BCE. The New Kingdom is the 3rd major division of Egyptian history. It was a time of artistic achievement, military might, prosperity at home, and prestige abroad. After the Middle Kingdom, a weak and divided Egypt was dominated by the Hyksos from Canaan for 100 years. They ruled in Lower Egypt, the north. Around 1550, an Upper Egyptian royal family rose and battled to oust the Hyksos and reunite the whole country. In 1532 BCE, they succeeded. Ahmose established the 18th dynasty and became the first pharaoh of the New Kingdom, Egypt's Golden Age. The New Kingdom. One of its early pharaohs, Thutmose I, conquered Palestine and the lands west of the Euphrates around 1500 BCE. During this rule of Amenhotep III, the New Kingdom, with its capital at Thebes, was rich and prosperous. Farmers and workers lived simply, but the nobility had a luxurious lifestyle. By law, men and women were equal and women owned property. Women were able to follow one of 4 main professions: priestess, midwife, dancer, or mourner. Apart from the nobles, scribes and priests held the most important positions in Egyptian society. Akhenaten. The strangest ruler was Amenhotep IV. He attempted to change Egyptian religion by replacing its many gods and complex traditions with worship of only one god, Aten. He changed his name to Akhenaten and built a new capital at El Amarna dedicated to Aten. His queen, Nefertiti, was not of royal birth and may not have been Egyptian. When Akhenaten died, the priests of the old gods regained control and worship of Aten was discouraged. The dead king's name was removed from every monument and record. His new city was abandoned and it was as if he had never existed. The end of greatness. Most New Kingdom rulers were buried in the Valley of the Kings in tombs cut deeply into the rock, but robbers still broke in. Only one tomb survived, almost intact to modern times, that of the boy king Tutankhamun, who succeeded Akhenaten and died not yet 20 years of age. Egypt stayed powerful for a time, especially under Seti I and his son Ramses II, the Great, of the 19th dynasty. Over time, rulers became weaker. priests took control, and finally Egypt fell to a succession of foreign invaders. The Greeks conquered Egypt and ruled for around 300 years. Finally, Egypt became a Roman territory. Her monuments fell to ruins. Her history and writings were forgotten. Let's see what's next. The Phoenicians. Let's see if there's a good stopping point. You know what? I know where we're gonna stop. Let's keep going. The Phoenicians, 1500 to 500 BCE. The Phoenicians were the greatest seafarers of the ancient world. They lived along a coastal strip in the Levant and the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea. The Phoenicians, who were merchant adventurers, lived in a string of independent city-states with good harbors in what is now Lebanon. Originally from Canaan, they were not interested in farming the land, but in seafaring, manufacturing, and trading. Trade and crafts. The Phoenicians traded overland with merchants carrying valuable goods from as far away as India and China to the west. The goods were sent by sea to Egypt, Greece, Italy, and northern Africa. This trade made Phoenicians prosperous and powerful. They saw the rise and fall of the Minoans and Mycenaeans, and actively helped the rise of Greece and then Rome. The Phoenicians were skilled craft workers, making glassware, metal items, jewelry, and cloth. They also invented glass blowing. The port of Tyre was famous for Tyrian purple dye, a rich color worn by Greeks and Romans as a sign of status. Phoenician ports. The Phoenician ports of the Levant were Ugarit, Sidon, Byblos, and Berytus, Beirut. The main port was Tyre, which, according to tradition, was founded 4,750 years ago. The city had close links with Israel. Hiram, king of Tyre, supplied King Solomon with mighty beams of Lebanon cedar wood and with craft workers to build his great temple in Jerusalem. Starting in Cyprus, the Phoenicians gradually spread westward and set up many colonies around the Mediterranean. The most important was Carthage in North Africa, which became a large city. Other colonies were in Spain, Malta, Sicily, Morocco, and Sardinia. Later, the Phoenicians colonized Cadiz and Tangier, founding trading ports down the coast of West Africa. Eventually, their homeland was invaded by the Babylonians around 570 BCE, so the colonies became independent, with Carthage as their chief port. Exploration. Around 600 BCE, the Egyptians commissioned the Phoenicians to sail around the coast of Africa. The voyage took 3 years. Regular trade with distant countries rich in tin and silver, like Britain, started around 450 BCE. The Phoenicians' downfall came between 200 and 100 BCE, when Rome, which was seeking to control the Mediterranean, fought them and destroyed Carthage. Moving on to Africa, 6000 to 200 BCE. Although the earliest human remains have been found in Africa, not much was known until recently of the continent's history before 1500 BCE, except for Egypt. Today, the Sahara forms a great desert barrier between northern and central Africa, but in about 6000 BCE that barrier did not exist. Rock drawings and paintings show that the climate was much wetter and that more people were able to live in the Sahara. The land began to dry up after around 3500 BCE, but desert trade towns and routes remained open, providing a link between northern and central Africa. Nubia and Kush, which I've done a whole video on actually, but anyway. Egyptian culture spread up the Nile to Nubia, now Sudan. The kingdom of Kush grew out of Nubia from 2000 BCE onward. Kush was valuable to Egypt as a trading partner and a source of gold. Egypt conquered Kush in 1500 BCE to secure gold deposits there, but in 750 BCE was itself conquered by the Kushites, who founded the 25th dynasty of pharaohs. Kush never had a Bronze Age, but went straight from using stone to using iron. The capital was moved from Napata, its religious center, to Meroe, because Meroe was surrounded by rich iron ore deposits. This meant that Kush became an important center of ironworking, supplying Egypt, Babylon, Arabia, and Ethiopia. Meroe imitated Egypt, and it preserved many Egyptian traditions for the future at a time when Egypt itself was going through cultural changes. Ethiopia was also an important, though self-contained, area of culture with religious traditions of its own. Central and Southern Africa. Around the Niger River lived farming tribes with a few trading towns. Downstream, the Nok nation of Nigeria became ironworking and village-dwelling craftspeople. To the east, there were the nomadic shepherds and village-dwelling people of Chad. Across Central Africa, Bantu peoples were moving south from Nigeria, taking ironworking and farming with them. Southern Africa was occupied by shepherds as well as hunter-gatherers known as the Khoisan. Then we're going to go to America. 1500 to 350 BCE. The first Americans arrived in North America overland from Asia in the Ice Age, when the sea level was lower. Over thousands of years they populated South America. The other day they found footprints in, I think, New Mexico that are from like tens of thousands of years earlier than what they believed people had first lived there. But anyway, many early Americans remained hunters, fishers, and food gatherers, but in two separate areas new civilizations developed: Mesoamerica in Mexico and Ecuador and Peru. The Olmecs of Mexico. In Mesoamerica, some 9,000 years ago, the Native Americans settled and grew crops of Indian corn, beans, and pumpkins. Small villages sprang up in which the people made pottery and wove cloth. I'm getting tired. Out of this culture, on 1500 BCE, the first American civilization was born. The city-dwelling Olmecs built their capital at La Venta, near the Gulf of Mexico. The Olmecs built large earth and stone pyramids as centers for religious worship, and they produced huge sculptures and fine jade carvings. Many of their sculptures mix human and jaguar-like features. The Olmecs also had their own kind of writing and a sophisticated calendar system. Their neighbors, the Zapotecs and Maya, also developed advanced city civilizations. Civilization in the Andes. The first fishing and farming villages in South America were in northern Peru. About 2,800 years ago, a more advanced culture appeared called the Chavin. The Chavin people made pottery, wove cloth on looms, built in stone, and made elaborate carvings. The largest building in their capital was 3 stories high. Inside was a maze of rooms, corridors, and stairs. I think we're going to end with Aryan India, because the next page, goes on to Rome. See Romulus and Remus up there. So we'll start off with that another day. Aryan India, 1500 to 500 BCE. Around 3,500 years ago, the Aryans, a band of tough warriors and shepherds, fled south across the Hindu Kush Mountains to settle in the subcontinent of India. A natural disaster, maybe drought or disease, or a civil war, made the Aryans flee from their homelands in southern Russia. They spread out to Anatolia and Persia as well as India. They lived in tribal villages, probably in wooden houses, unlike the brick cities of the Indus Valley people. The Aryans of India. Aryans counted their wealth in cattle and sheep. They were not as advanced as the Indian peoples, but they were tougher. They were warriors and gamblers, beef eaters and wine drinkers, and loved music, dancing, and chariot racing. Gradually, they settled down and adopted many of the ways of the native Indians, becoming crop growers and ironworkers. Among the crops was rice, unknown to the Aryans, but already grown in the Indus Valley. Hindu culture. The use of the plow and irrigation systems enabled the Aryans to grow enough crops to support large towns. By 500 BCE, there were 16 major kingdoms in northern India, the most prominent being Magadha. Magadha was the birthplace of the Mauryan Empire and of 2 new religions, Jainism and Buddhism. The Aryans had no form of writing. Like many ancient peoples, they passed on their history and religious beliefs by word of mouth. These traditions, called the Vedas, the books of knowledge, were written down much later. The oldest of these is the Rig Veda, a collection of more than 1,000 hymns composed in their language, Sanskrit. Most of what we know about the Aryans' daily lives in ancient times comes from the Vedas, the ancient Old Testament of the Hindus. Unlike other faiths, Hinduism was not started by one teacher. Its beliefs accumulated gradually over time. So that's where we're going to stop tonight before the start of the Roman Empire. Let me know what you guys think. I think this book is so cool. It goes all the way up to like the 2010s, like the early 2010s. So cool. But anyway, thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this video relaxing and educational. And I hope that you have a very good night.